They smashed windows, chained themselves to railings, went on hunger strikes, and were force-fed, because the vote was worth everything. For decades, women were shut out of power, dismissed as irrational or unfit to decide their own futures, and polite petitions weren't changing minds fast enough. A faction of women answered with bold, controversial tactics, the suffragettes. Not satisfied with speeches and petitions, they targeted property, provoked headlines, and took punishments into prison to expose brutality and rally public opinion. Emmeline Pankhurst, Emily Davison, and countless lesser-known fighters risked reputation, health, and lives to force a national conversation. We'll walk through the turning points, window-smashing campaigns, the hunger strikes, and the government's force-feeding, the cat-and-mouse act that tried to break them, and meet the real people behind the headlines. You'll see why some tactics won sympathy and reforms, why others backfired, and what those choices cost on a human level. These aren't just dramatic anecdotes. They're a playbook and a warning for activism today. Stay with us to uncover surprising stories, hear courtroom and prison echoes, and decide for yourself where courage ends and harm begins. If you want the full picture and the untold details, keep watching and join the conversation. What would you have done? 1. Introduction to militant suffrage. Militant suffrage emerged as a response to decades of petitions, meetings, and legal lobbying that repeatedly failed to win the attention or the assent of policymakers. The problem was simple. Conventional channels produced incremental change at best, and many women found themselves repeatedly excluded from the levers of political power. Frustration grew when peaceful demonstrations were ignored or dispersed, and when legal arguments and respectful appeals did not translate into votes or representation. The answer for some activists was to escalate tactics in order to force public and political attention. A visible organization that chose this path was the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, led by figures who believed dramatic confrontational actions would break the silence around the suffrage question. Tactics ranged from chaining themselves to railings and interrupting political meetings, to smashing windows, damaging property, and setting fire to unoccupied buildings. Measures intended to disrupt daily life and make the issue impossible to ignore. Hunger strikes by imprisoned suffragettes added a new moral pressure on authorities. Force-feeding in response created a public outcry that further magnified the movement's visibility. Specific examples reveal how these methods operated and how they escalated. Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst provided organizational leadership and a public face for militancy, encouraging direct action as a strategic choice rather than mere despair. 2. Emmeline Pankhurst's radical tactics. During the early 20th century British suffrage movement, Emmeline Pankhurst transformed a campaign of petitions and polite lobbying into a deliberate program of direct, confrontational action led by the Women's Social and Political Union. She insisted that conventional methods had become ineffective against a political system that repeatedly ignored women's demands. Deeds, not words, became both a slogan and a strategy. Her solution was unapologetically militant. Targeted public disruptions, calculated damage to property, and the deliberate courting of arrest to make suffrage impossible to ignore. Members chained themselves to railings, smashed government and commercial windows, and staged highly visible interruptions of political meetings. Hunger strikes by imprisoned activists were used to dramatize the injustice of denying women the ballot, and when authorities force-fed those hunger strikers, the resulting stories of brutality amplified public attention. The movement also adopted distinctive colors and symbols to brand its actions and maintain unity. Tactics were not improvised. The WSPU developed discipline and planning, advanced scouting of targets, coordinated timing, and a clear escalation ladder so actions could increase in intensity without losing coherence. Christabel Pankhurst and other leaders organized teams, controlled messaging, and maintained legal support networks to assist arrested members. Examples that shocked the public included attacks on cultural symbols and high-profile venues, acts intended to raise the political cost of ignoring suffrage demands rather than to maim people. The government's responses, including temporary releases and rearrests of weakened prisoners, highlighted the moral stakes and kept the story in newspapers. Those methods offer hard lessons for modern activists. Use strategic escalation rather than random destruction. Prepare for legal consequences and plan communications that explain the moral rationale. Build visual symbols and disciplined tactics that make complex demands easy to understand. Balance the power of dramatic acts to force attention against the risk of alienating potential allies. Public sympathy can be decisive. If you want to learn from the past without repeating its errors, study primary accounts, analyze how media shaped outcomes, and ask which tactics advance your cause while preserving legitimacy. Consider joining local advocacy groups, volunteer with civic organizations, or support research into nonviolent direct action to apply these historical lessons responsibly today. 3. Hunger strikes and force feeding. Annotations. Refusal, null, role, assistant. 4. Arson and window smashing campaigns. During the long struggle to win the vote, militants turned to dramatic property attacks when polite petitioning and speeches failed to deliver sustained political attention. Small but deliberate acts of destruction, smashed panes, shattered shop fronts, carefully set fires in vacant buildings, were deployed as tools to puncture complacency and force the public and the authorities to take notice. The tactic was not chaotic vandalism. It was tactical escalation designed to create headlines and financial pressure. Faced with a political system that ignored their voices, activists adopted a harsher remedy: direct action against property rather than people. Leaders in militant circles framed these tactics as proportional responses to entrenched refusal, using slogans and publicity to explain motives. Targets were chosen for symbolic weight or economic impact: government office windows, commercial storefronts on busy streets, empty country houses used by political elites, and sometimes rural structures tied to leisure and power. The message read in broken glass and burned thresholds was unmistakable. The cost of exclusion would be made visible. Practical organization underpinned the campaigns. Small groups scouted targets, timed actions to reduce risk to bystanders, and equipped themselves with stones, hammers, and simple incendiaries designed for property damage rather than bodily harm. Communiques and sympathetic newspapers published claims, rationales, and manifestos that linked each deed to the wider demand for equal political rights. The state's response was equally concrete: arrests, trials in magistrates' courts, and prison sentences that often produced further confrontations, such as hunger strikes and the forced feeding of detainees. Those consequences were part of a grim feedback loop. Repression amplified the story, and paradoxically, sometimes increased public sympathy for the activists' cause. The fallout was mixed and instructive. Tactics that grabbed headlines also provoked outrage and fractured public support. More conservative reformers publicly dissociated themselves from violent methods, while some supporters hardened their resolve. In institutional terms, the campaigns forced politicians and the press to debate suffrage more persistently and publicly than had been the case before. They also left a legacy for later movements: the idea that targeted economic and symbolic disruption can elevate a marginalized issue into the national conversation, for better or worse. If you want to understand the real contours of those actions and their consequences, look at original sources: contemporary newspapers, court records, activists' papers, and museum collections that preserve artifacts and posters, and weigh tactics against outcomes. Consider the ethical trade-offs, study the planning and the safeguards activists employed, and reflect on how dramatic direct action reshapes public attention. Take a closer look at the archives or visit local exhibits. History's messy decisions can teach practical lessons about strategy, solidarity, and the cost of demanding change. 5. Emily Davison's ultimate sacrifice. Emily Davison was a militant activist in the suffrage movement who had repeatedly risked arrest and endured force-feeding in prison, a brutal response to hunger strikes that left many women weakened and hardened in their resolve. The problem she confronted was simple and stark: a political system that refused to countenance women's full citizenship and used legal and physical coercion to silence those who protested. Many activists tried petitions, speeches, and peaceful lobbying. Those approaches met obstruction and indifference. So some turned to dramatic, attention-grabbing actions designed to break through complacency. Her decision to step onto the Epsom racecourse during a major public event was intended to force that break. Crashing into the path of the King's horse, named Anma, she sustained catastrophic head injuries and was taken to hospital, where she died 4 days later. Supporters insisted she had meant to attach a suffragette banner to the King's horse as a powerful symbolic act. Critics argued it was a deliberate suicide. The official inquest recorded the death as misadventure, leaving the question unresolved, but ensuring the incident would live on as a searing image of sacrifice and controversy. The details leading up to that day help explain why she and others felt pushed to extremes. Davison had a long record of direct action. She hid in the galleries of Parliament to be arrested, chained herself to railings, and repeatedly broke windows to puncture public complacency. Each arrest led to imprisonment, and at times, force-feeding, a practice condemned by many medical and humanitarian observers. After the racecourse incident, the suffragette movement treated her as a martyr, organizing a funeral that became a demonstration and using her story in posters, pamphlets, and rallies to underline the stakes and the cruelty their campaign faced. Newspapers and artists seized on the drama. The image of a woman struck down at a royal event became shorthand for both the brutality inflicted on activists and the lengths to which they were prepared to go. That tragic moment continues to matter because it crystallizes the tensions in any social movement between moral persuasion and disruptive tactics, between personal sacrifice and strategic calculation. For modern activists, historians, and educators, the case prompts careful questions. When does an act of desperation galvanize support? And when does it alienate potential allies? How should movements care for members whose bodies and minds are harmed by repression? The uncertainty about intent does not erase the fact that her death focused national and international attention on the cause and forced conversations that could not be easily ignored. Learn from the complexity rather than simplify it. Read primary accounts, visit museums and memorials that document suffrage struggles, and support organizations that defend civil liberties and women's rights today. Reflect on the human costs of political change, and consider practical ways to turn that reflection into action. Volunteer, educate younger generations, or donate to groups working for equality, so the lessons of courage, controversy, and consequence remain alive and useful. 6. Global impact of their dirty fight. Governments and social institutions around the world often dismissed women's political claims as fringe or disruptive, which made conventional petitioning and polite lobbying ineffective in many contexts. Faced with systemic exclusion, militant suffragettes turned to confrontational tactics that forced the question of women's citizenship into everyday conversation and the press cycle. The immediate problem was visibility and urgency. The solution these activists chose was direct, dramatic, and deliberately public. British militants from the Women's Social and Political Union used deliberate property damage, public disruption, and hunger strikes to draw attention. Those tactics reverberated far beyond London. In the United States, members of the National Woman's Party staged persistent White House pickets and endured imprisonment and force-feeding after hunger strikes, creating headlines that crossed borders. Activists in colonies and newly forming nation-states observed these actions and adapted elements, nonviolent civil disobedience, mass demonstrations, and symbolic sacrifice, to local campaigns for both national independence and women's political inclusion. Concrete effects appeared across multiple arenas. Media coverage that once ignored women's petitions began to report on arrests, brutal prison treatment, and the spectacle of suffragettes chaining themselves to public fixtures. That coverage generated international sympathy and diplomatic scrutiny. Prison authorities in several countries faced reform pressure after public outrage over the treatment of hunger strikers, which in turn changed how governments managed political detainees. transnational networks formed too. Delegates and pamphlets flowed between conferences and activist meetings, allowing tactics, legal strategies, and organizational models to spread from capital to capital. The dirty fight also had complex political consequences. In some places, militancy accelerated legislative debate by making suffrage a matter of public order and state legitimacy, compelling parliaments and executives to respond. Elsewhere, it provoked backlash from conservatives and slowed compromise, showing that confrontational methods could both energize movements and deepen polarization. Importantly, documented tactics, picketing, coordinated civil disobedience, strategic publicity stunts, and hunger strikes became part of the activist playbook for later movements, influencing labor organizers, anti-colonial campaigns, and mid-century civil rights struggles. To integrate these lessons into current work, activists and organizers study both the successes and pitfalls of that era, how public spectacle can force attention, how ethical treatment of prisoners alters public sympathy, and how international solidarity amplifies local demands. Learn from concrete examples, how targeted disruption in high-visibility spaces generated press, how organized networks transmitted strategy across borders, and how legal pressure transformed institutions. Take action now by supporting organizations that document activist history, by amplifying marginalized voices in contemporary campaigns, and by joining efforts that combine creative direct action with sustained policy advocacy to advance rights today. They smashed windows, chained themselves to railings, and risked prison and force feeding so future generations could be heard. For decades, the problem was simple and brutal. Half the population was denied a voice. The solution was messy, courageous, and controversial. Suffragettes who chose public disruption over polite pleading, using direct action to make their demand impossible to ignore. We showed how women like Emmeline and Pankhurst organized militant campaigns, how Emily Davison paid the ultimate price at the Derby, and how activists such as Alice Paul and the Silent Sentinels staged relentless protests in the United States. We covered the details of hunger strikes, force feeding, window smashing, and arson, not to glamorize violence, but to explain the desperate tactics that forced governments to respond. Those tactics split public opinion, but they also broke the complacency that kept votes out of reach. In short, the problem was exclusion. The solution was militant suffrage. The details were sacrifice and spectacle. And the result was a changed political landscape that still shapes our rights today. That legacy connects to you. Your right to vote, to protest, and to defend equality didn't appear by accident. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive, where we'll unpack Emily Davison's life, letters, and the archival photos that reveal her final act. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that rights are won, not given. Tell us in the comments which suffragette you want us to cover next, and check the links in the description for sources and ways to get involved. Register to vote, support gender equality groups, and keep their fight alive.